Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today we're talking nuclear energy once again, nuclear waste, of course. And we are talking with Diane D'Arrigo, and she is the radioactive waste director with NIRS, and that stands for Nuclear Information and Resource Service. Diane, thanks for taking the time to talk today.
You're very welcome.
So let's begin by talking a little bit about your organization. It's been around for more than 40 years. Tell us about it.
Nuclear Information and Resource Service started in the late 70s, concerned about both nuclear power and nuclear weapons and the dangers of the technology to create it and the consequences of it. Our focus was to support local grassroots groups around the country. So it is a national group, but our main focus is to help local groups, local and state governments, to tackle nuclear issues.
You know, one of the most controversial aspects of nuclear energy is the waste that it creates. So let's begin by talking about how actually is the spent nuclear fuel or nuclear waste created?
So whenever you make nuclear energy, whether it's the current kind of nuclear reactors that we have, whether it's this proposed as yet uncreated small or micro reactors, it's based on splitting the uranium atom. So when the uranium atom, U-235, is banged with a neutron, it splits, and the energy that bound that uranium together is released in heat, which heats water, turns turbines, and makes electricity. But it also forms other radioactive materials, cesium, strontium, iodines, and those are very biologically active, and some were never naturally occurring on the Earth, and some have been in much smaller amounts. So these elements then need to be isolated, and they are similar to or exactly the same as elements that would be taken up into the biological systems, into our bodies. So cesium is a muscle seeker. So it goes to muscles, and the heart is a muscle. And we've now learned that not only does radioactivity cause cancer, but it also is a major cause of heart disease, ischemic heart disease. And it can also reduce immunity, which makes us more susceptible to other ailments. The other thing that happens, we'll go back to your uranium-235 atom in the reactor core, is that it might absorb the neutron and form plutonium or neptunium or americium, elements that are heavier than uranium. And these happen to be, they're called transuranics, and they're very long lasting, and they're especially dangerous if inhaled or ingested. They are alpha emitters, so the radioactive energy that they give off is not real penetrating, but once it gets into the body, it continues to irradiate from within. And it is 20 or more times more dangerous, more harmful than X-rays or gamma rays. So when we're making nuclear energy, the inevitable creation of nuclear waste is a result, and that's going to last longer than the fleeting electricity, the fleeting energy that is used and gone. So using this type of technology is a decision to create materials that really historically have never been been able to be fully isolated from the environment. And that's where Wyoming comes in. Over the decades, Wyoming has been targeted or considered for places to bring this material. And since there's no material that lasts longer than some of the radionuclides that are formed, you're not going to be able to isolate it as long as it's dangerous. Oh, so I should tell you one more thing about the radioactive elements is that cesium 137, which goes to muscle, strontium is in the same column in the chart of the nuclides as as calcium. So it goes where calcium goes in the body and in milk and in the environment, but it goes to our bones, it causes leukemia, and it causes bone cancer. So strontium 90 is not our friend. And then it also would form iodines. Now, iodines are naturally occurring, but iodine 129, and only a little of it is created in the reactor. It has a 17 million year half-life. So you have to multiply the half-life by 10 or 20, and that's how long it takes to decay down to undetectable. So iodine 129, 17 million times 10 or 20, you could have 360 million years, or wait, 340, sorry, million years of need to isolate. And when it gets into the environment and the body sees it, it thinks, oh, here's iodine. So it goes to the thyroid or wherever else iodine goes. So that's why it's better to not make it in the first place. But I know that's not what we're here to discuss. We're here to discuss where does what we've already got go. But I know that since there are proposals for nuclear power in Wyoming, I think people need to be fully aware that if you don't make it, you don't have to try to isolate it.
It's a very good point. And speaking of the impact on the human body, from what you know of the nuclear power plants around the country, and most store their own nuclear waste or spent nuclear fuel right on site, and the historical aspect of Los Alamos, for example, do we know where the most sickness has come from in terms of people getting near radioactive or nuclear waste in history?
Well, we've had a real blackout on the health effects around nuclear reactors. There have been, back in the 80s, early 90s, UNSCEAR, United Nations Scientific Committee on Atomic Radiation, did a report which was very poorly designed. It looked at health effects around reactors, but if you look at the wind patterns, usually the wind blows in one direction or in a set of directions. So by doing a circumferential study, it dilutes the impact of those who are on those who are downwind. So that was a problematic study that tried to claim that there wasn't a big problem. The National Academy of Sciences was tasked by some of our government agencies to look at radiation around nuclear reactor health effects around nuclear reactors, and it was a two-part study. They did the first part, but then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission pulled the funding from the second part, and there were several reactors that were chosen, and so that the first part was making the protocol. And even though the National Academy of Sciences has a wonderful reputation with regard to nuclear issues, it is completely skewed pro-nuclear. So the nuclear divisions, I could have another meeting with you and talk about some of the National Academy's ways that they skew studies when it comes to nuclear. I am going to tell you one right now.
Sure.
There was a proposed nuclear waste site in Southern California, and there was a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey who said the radioactivity could get into the groundwater from this site. And the mechanism by which this radioactivity would travel, I can't remember if he was saying it moved in the liquid phase or the gaseous phase, but he had his theory and his concern. When the National Academy set up a panel to review that concern, all the scientists that were on the technical committee, portion of the committee to review it, had all of their published data that the method of tritium migration was in the other phase. So they would have had to discount their own history of studies in order to side with the scientists whose work was being reviewed. Now, that may be more detail than you want here on a side issue, but the problem is that the National Academy is seen as a very objective source, and on most scientific issues, I think it is. But when it comes to the nuclear issue, There is a history. There's a book called by Boffey, The Brain Bank, and it has a chapter specifically devoted to how the National Academy, which in its original earlier days was objective on reviewing the Atomic Energy Commission. But then when it was coming out with critical conclusions, the Department of Energy came in and pretty much said, you're not getting funded unless you have this other perspective. So we've got documentation of that, and it's a problem when we're looking for objective science. I will say, though, that despite that, the National Academy of Sciences has been concerned about the dangers of transportation of nuclear materials, and it does do some work that is useful.
Sure, sure. And actually the transportation of spent nuclear fuel or whatnot is obviously going to be a challenge down the road if a repository is found. And speaking of that, let's talk about the history. We've got Yucca Mountain,
Oh, wait, let's do
obviously.
one more thing. Hang on,
Sure.
let's definitely get to Yucca. But when we're talking about just the technical, what is this radioactivity? So in the core of a nuclear reactor, you've got fuel rods, or in some proposed reactors, instead of water circulating around rods, it might be balls, or it might be other um, uh, sodium or other um, materials that convey the heat to turn the turbines to make the electricity. But in general, what you've got, as I said, is the uranium splits and it forms other elements, and its binding energy heats the water. And then the neutrons that are given off by that uranium, they bang into other uraniums and those split, and we have a chain reaction. So that's the goal of fission nuclear power is that. Now, in the current generation of reactors, light water reactors in the United States, what you end up with then is these rods. Let's see, you've got uranium in the ground. It's not real concentrated. It gets concentrated through many steps in a fuel chain to get the most uranium-235. Then they make it into little pellets. They put it into rods, and then the rods are formed into an assembly, and then a couple hundred assemblies go into the core of a reactor. So in these rods, over the 3 or 4 years that they are in the core, you've got the uranium splitting and forming all of those radioactive elements that I mentioned, the transuranics that are alpha emitters that are especially bad if inhaled, and then the lighter ones that concentrate in bones and muscle and so forth. So these are all concentrated. And the rods, the assemblies, the rods, they can give a lethal dose in minutes unshielded. And what and then if they then go into water-filled pools where they're stored for at least 3, 4, 5 years, maybe longer, maybe shorter, and then they're moved into dry storage containers. So when the dry storage containers are moved to a proposed new site, each of those containers it has more more cesium than was released at Chernobyl in each container, and more plutonium than was released in the Nagasaki, the plutonium nuclear bomb that we dropped. Each container. And I want to also say that we have a nuclear power and weapons industry. There's mining and milling and conversion and concentration or enrichment and fuel fabrication and reactors and bomb production. The inventory of all of the radioactivity in that fuel chain for power and weapons, over 95%, 97% is in the commercial irradiated fuel. We're talking about the hottest part. I mean, we're talking about the majority. That doesn't mean that weapons waste isn't dangerous. Of course it's bad. And the so-called low-level waste is very bad. But what we're talking about, we're moving irradiated fuel and concentrating it. The proposed dump in New Mexico, which would Holtec has gotten a license for, and then the courts have overturned the license. that would have been the largest concentration of man-made radioactivity on the planet, because we've got hundred reactors and we've got waste going there. I want to express the importance of the danger of the material. This is not just a commodity. It's not just a legal issue of who's liable and who's not, but that's another piece of it that's really important.
Sure. Okay. No, that is, and I've done a lot of these interviews, and rarely have we spoken about the issues in terms of the health aspects, and that's obviously that's the issue that people really care
Right.
about,
That's
and
right.
because that's the
And
life
your
or
water
death.
supply and
Yep.
your environment, the
Right.
animals. I mean,
That's
people
the question.
hunt.
So given that, let's talk real quickly about the history of trying to find a repository in like Yucca Mountain, which, you know, I think billions were spent prepping that. It's never going to happen, from what I understand. Why do you think it's so hard to find a place to store this?
Because it lasts it's not forever because it does decay, but we're talking into the millions and billions of years of danger. Now, we've got nuclear proponents are wanting to, that would be um, wanting to make more of this stuff, want to deny the dangers. And you can't see, smell, hear, taste this material. And so it is hard to, you can see pollution, from other sources, but you cannot see radioactive pollution. And the detection equipment is it's expensive. It requires education to be able to operate it properly. You have to have the right equipment for the right radioactivity. So it's a complicated and interesting science,
Sure,
but
sure.
it's not uh, we can't sense it with our common sense. And
Right.
because it's so long lasting, we're being asked to trust that computer model predictions will work, when in fact, computer model predictions haven't necessarily worked for the time that we've uh, been operating, the last 50 years or so.
Sure, sure. So let's talk about Wyoming for a second, and what kind of
Well, I do
message.
want to say about Yucca, though, you were starting to get,
Go ahead, you
is
go
that
Yucca first. Go
that
ahead.
site has volcanoes, it has earthquake risks, it has a water table that would be impacted, and the regulations that were designed to protect from the radioactivity in the site had to be changed a number of times in order to continue to consider that site. And it may have been canceled, people say, for political reasons. It was really chosen for political reasons, and it was canceled for both political reasons, but they were based on the scientific reality that the site could not isolate the waste.
Understood. So, if you had to share your thoughts, your brief thoughts, on with the lawmakers in Wyoming and the people of Wyoming about them considering being a location for spent nuclear fuel storage, what would you say?
Don't do it. The risks are higher than the benefits. The money will be fleeting. The the consequences are permanent. There's never been a site that's been fully cleaned up. Reprocessing is makes the problem even worse. I got into this issue because I come from an area where this irradiated or spent fuel was reprocessed, and I'm in my 60s and I'm still going back 4 times a year to track the cleanup of that site. We are groveling every year for federal funds to keep cleaning it up. We don't want to be in a position. You don't want to be in a position of having to do that. And I think others on your shows have talked about the reality that temporary is it's a lure to say that it's only going to be here for a little while. It's going to take 40 or 50 years to move all the irradiated fuel we have to a location, be it permanent, be it temporary. Do you really think then that they're going to spend 50 more years shipping it away, and that there'll be no contamination, or there'll be no significant contamination in the time that it's there? It's there have to be better industrial options than than
Sure.
radioactive waste.
And tell us about the spot you're talking about where you go back 4 times a year. Where is that?
West Valley, New York. It's about 30 miles south of and upstream and upwind of Buffalo, New York, and the Great Lakes.
Okay.
Operated for 6 years, taking the irradiated fuel that I described. It disassembled the assemblies, it chopped the rods, it dissolved them in chemicals, and extracted the uranium and plutonium that is still left in the rods. And actually, a lot of it is left. It's not a very efficient process, nuclear energy. But so they take out the uranium and plutonium that's left with the promise or the hope of using it to make more fuel. However, the West Valley operation did not ever, the waste was never used for new fuel. It might
Sure.
have gone into the weapons program, and we think that it contaminated other enrichment facilities. Anyway, 6 years is how long it operated. There were fires, high worker exposures. At one point, Cattaraugus Creek, which runs from near the site to the Great Lakes to Lake Erie, was the hottest radioactive water in the country during the operations. As I said, high worker exposures. So it was called reprocessing, and now it's being called recycling to give it the impression that it's green. But in
Right.
fact, um, what it's doing is taking those elements I described that are in the rods, and it was opening them up and dissolving them. And so, of course, these things got into the air, got into the water, leaked into the water, exposed the workers. And it's taking the hottest part of the nuclear power and weapons fuel chain, bringing it together, and actually opening it up and messing with it, and then saying that this is an efficient way to fuel new reactors.
Right. So was that site was that doesn't sound like it was a full nuclear power plant, or was it, or
No,
what were
no, it
they
was
doing
a
there?
nuclear reprocessing site,
Gotcha. Okay.
operated in the 60s and 70s, and it was also a waste burial ground. Um, the irradiated fuel from the reactors that were operating in the 60s and 70s were shipped there to the site from reactors in New York and New England, from Puerto Rico, from I think California and the Midwest.
Were there
They
ever any problems during that shipping that you
uh,
know of?
the the shipping records, the government did not start keeping records of shipping incidents until the 1990s or the 2000s.
Okay.
I'm trying to think, there was concern about it. I don't know that any of and also the shipping containers, then they were shipping it underwater. Now we've got gas, an environment, we don't ship it with water.
Right.
There have been in the history of our country, and submarine fuel being shipped and reactor fuel, there have been accidents, there have been incidences with nuclear materials. Um, there hasn't been the kind of devastating accident that we worry about, where there was a breach and the
Right.
radioactivity got out. But there
Got it.
have been in other parts of the fuel chain, certainly. There are statistically a certain number of accidents for miles shipped, and
Right.
it's consistent with that. And we can expect, with a lot of shipments, some portion of it being having accidents, and then a certain percentage of those breaking the seal. There's a little O-ring that is the seal on the containers, and if you remember the Challenger, it was an O-ring that
Right.
led to that uh, disaster. So O-rings are still, I believe, what's relied on. Now, with regard to transportation, the Sandia Labs back down in New Mexico did some crash tests and fire tests back in the 60s. And finally, the Department of Energy is doing new tests. They've got a new fuel car that they are saying, oh, we're going to update our testing. But what is not being updated, which is very important, are the regulations that apply to the transport containers. They are only designed, and they only have to survive a 30-foot drop. and many bridges are higher than that. Fire for 90 minutes at a certain temperature. Temperatures are much higher on fires, and fires last much longer than 90 minutes. They have so we've got the drop test, the fire test, the crash tests, and if they were to go underwater, it's a very short amount of time that they're required to be withstand the water pressure, depending how deep. And the reality, though, is these are enormous, heavy containers, and most communities, if it went underwater, they'd have to find it, they'd have to get it out of the water, and the equipment to do that is simply not available. You'd have to order it from other parts of the country and come in, and it would be a big deal
Sure.
situation.
If people want to learn more about your organization, where can they go?
It's the website's www.nirs.org, and our phone line is 301-270-NIRS, NIRS, or what is it? 301-270-6577, I think.
Okay, no worries. So folks out there, if you want to learn more about what's happening around the state of Wyoming, you can go to wyliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Diane, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.